The attacks that shook the world on September 11, 2001 changed the United States forever. The largest terrorist attack from a foreign entity on US soil to ever happen would cause a ripple with intense consequences for the Middle East, as well as the US and its allies. Global terror would rise. Millions of lives would be affected. National security would change. Pop culture would evolve. And ultimately, a society in shock would go to the other side of the world looking for justice. This was the attack that would shape the world order for the next 20 years. And it would all start with the young son of a billionaire named Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was born in Saudi Arabia, his family wealthy and prominent from construction and politics. Growing up, he was influenced by his father's strict interpretation of Islam. In the 1980s, bin Laden joined the Afghan resistance against the Soviet Union, which later led to the formation of Al-Qaeda just a few years later.
When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, bin Laden went to the Saudi royal family and offered his followers to defend the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. Instead, the Saudis invited in US troops.
He became obsessed with the idea of expelling foreign forces from Muslim lands. Bin Laden's militant activities escalated, culminating in the 1998 US Embassy bombings in East Africa, as well as the year 2000 attack on the USS Cole, and ultimately orchestrating the attacks on September 11, 2001, which in his words, exceeded all expectations. We throw these names around, Al-Qaeda and Taliban, and use them almost as synonyms, but it's important to note the difference. Al-Qaeda is not a governing entity like the Taliban, and its primary focus is on carrying out acts of terrorism and insurgency, rather than governing or imposing a specific form of rule like the Taliban. Al-Qaeda's oppression primarily takes the form of violence, intimidation, and the destabilization of regions in which it operates. The Taliban, on the other hand, has a history of implementing a strict and oppressive form of Islamic rule in areas under their control. These include enforcement of Sharia law, restriction on women's rights, limitations on personal expression, media control, suppression of political opposition, restrictions on education, and restrictions on the economy that results in poverty. In an oversimplification, I like to think of the Taliban as the main governing body, with Al-Qaeda as a militaristic branch of that government, or even as a deeply rooted mercenary group, similar to how Wagner operated in Russia. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda have a history of collaboration, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The relationship between these two groups is complex and it's evolved over time. During the 1990s, leading up to the September 11th attacks, there were some scary trends happening among international terrorist groups. There was growing Islamic extremism. Al-Qaeda was getting bigger and becoming more violent every year. Afghanistan was a place of refuge for terrorist organizations, and these trends weren't stopping. It was amidst these global terrorism trends that the unthinkable happened. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 rocks the world by crashing into the World Trade Center's North Tower. Everyone on board, as well as many people in the building, are killed instantly. Everyone above the 91st floor is trapped. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashes into the South Tower. I remember this one. I was 8 years old and watching it on live TV when it happened. The world watched in horror as New York City was clearly under attack. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon, killing everyone on board as well as 125 civilians and military personnel who were in the building. At 9:45 a.m., US airspace is shut down and all planes are ordered to land at the nearest airport. At 9:57 a.m., passengers on Flight 93 heroically charge forward to take back control of the plane, which results in them crashing to the ground and saving many would-be victims from another attack. 2 minutes later, at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapses. President Bush authorizes any non-grounded planes to be shot down. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapses. In total, 2,977 people were killed, with thousands of others injured, and millions directly affected. It was one of the deadliest acts of terrorism in history, and it had a lasting impact on the United States as well as the world. Americans were shocked and traumatized by what had just happened. Justice had to be served, no matter the cost. It was a unique social and political climate in the nation's history. a time when people put aside their differences and came together in unity to search out and fight off a new enemy.
We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail.
Within less than a month, George W. Bush declares a war on terror, and we invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban regime and disrupt al-Qaeda's operations. Within just 2 months, the Taliban had effectively collapsed. The search for Osama bin Laden went on as he went into hiding. On March 23, 2003, the US invades Iraq to put an end to Saddam Hussein's rule. There's a lot of shady evidences and lies that were put forward to justify this invasion and gain public support. Whether Bush knew about the shady evidence presented by the intelligence agencies or not is up for debate. But the fact remained that Saddam Hussein was an evil dictator who needed to go. He was a leader who had totalitarian control, committed human rights abuses, killed thousands of people in chemical attacks, suppressed minority groups, restricted freedom of expression, conducted mass surveillance, carried out ethnic cleansing, and had ruthless repression of uprisings. He was a terrible person. He had been in power for 24 years, and the Iraqi people were helpless against his evil rule. He was an evil man that the world could do without. Just like Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq started off very smoothly. So smoothly, in fact, that on May 1st of that same year, less than 2 months from the initial invasion, Bush declared victory.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
In December of that year, Saddam Hussein would be captured and then 3 years later executed for his crimes.
Intelligence headquarters at Kazimir. Saddam, as we said, dressed in this raincoat, black suit, with his feet and hands tied, being taken from the execution room to the gallows. He is now being told that he can have the hood, but he refused that. He went to the rope, seeing that noose before him, and he was then given this scarf to be tied around his neck, for the rope to be tied around that. His final moments with some bravery, shouting, "God is great," and that the nation would live on, and that Palestine was Arab. Final words of defiance.
Now, just real quick, there are a lot of opinions about whether or not this war was justified. The only point I want to make here is a comparison to the current war in Ukraine. I've heard people say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine can be compared to the United States invasion of Iraq, which couldn't be further from the truth. Ukraine is a free country with elections, free speech, and equal rights. It's a nation that sees women as equal to men. Iraq in 2003 had a totalitarian government and consistently oppressed and killed their own people. It was far from a free country and was hostile towards Iran, Kuwait, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. It was also known to offer support and be a safe haven for various terrorist groups. Ukraine, on the other hand, is a peaceful nation, without hostilities toward any other nations except those who have made the first move in attacking their sovereignty. That is the difference between the United States invasion of Iraq and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Following the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, there were some monumental challenges that arose. The conflicts got worse, and insurgent groups pushed back harder and harder. There were a number of problems that would prove Bush's victory speech to be premature. Bush himself would even later say that the speech was a mistake.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children.
Osama bin Laden was assassinated by US Special Forces in 2011. The Taliban was pretty much gone in Afghanistan, and Iraq was turning into a bog with many unforeseen challenges. Al-Qaeda in Iraq turned into Islamic State of Iraq, which then transformed into Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. This ended up bringing more US troops into Iraq following their withdrawal. The 2 bloody decades that followed the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq had a death toll in the hundreds of thousands, with some estimates even saying that over 1 million people died. Views on the US invasion of Iraq from within the country are varied for numerous reasons. The people recognize that Saddam Hussein was an evil dictator that had to go, so they're often very grateful for that. The way that things were handled after the toppling of his regime is a different story.
20 years after the invasion, and most of Baghdad looks like this, no longer a war zone. Gone are the cement blast walls and barbed wires. The shops and cafes and marketplaces like this are open and they're busy. Residents here are hopeful, if not necessarily optimistic, for a peaceful future.
And most of these older gentlemen, really anyone of adult age, was here during the US invasion and during the occupation of this city. And they know we're American, and still, the level of hospitality and kindness they offer us, it's like you almost can't believe it. After everything they've been through, to show us that level of warmth is just like amazing. Like, I can promise you, you would not find that level of hospitality in America. I think Americans are nice. I think they're generally kind to people, and I think they're welcoming to people, but it's not to that level.
نسوي لكم هاي الشوارع نبلط لكم اياها، نسوي لكم مجاري كهرباء نعطيكم اياها، ماكو كل هذا ماكو، في سبيل اجوا ودمروا الشعب، باقوا ثروات العراق، باقوا شعب العراق كله وراحوا ونهزموا هم.
والله بال20 سنة كل شيء متحقق بالعراق. لا شوارع، لا تبليط، لا امان. يعني ما تحقق شيء بالعراق.
وعد بوش بأنه سوف يجعل العراق جنة بعد سقوط النظام، لكن العكس ما شفناه يعني.
In the US, public views about the war is mixed as well. As with most conflicts, support went down as the wars dragged on and results were slow, with mounting deaths and costs to the economy. Bush would later say mistakes had been made. Among them was his 2003 Mission Accomplished speech. No question it was a mistake, Bush said. And as far as the failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, no one was more shocked and angry than I was when we didn't find the weapons. But still, he was insistent that going into the war in Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein from power was the right thing to do. The US set out to kill Saddam Hussein, topple his government, remove the Taliban from Afghanistan, destroy al-Qaeda, and kill Osama bin Laden. All of those objectives were a success. But it wasn't exactly mission accomplished because Iraq still struggles. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. ISIS emerged from al-Qaeda, both of which have mostly been defeated. But the Taliban took back Afghanistan as soon as the US pulled out of that country. So we're left with an emerging nation within Iraq that will hopefully destroy the corruption from within and end up on top. Two major terrorist organizations have been weakened potentially beyond repair, and Afghanistan is back under its oppressive regime. The question has to be asked, was it all worth it? The horrifying attack on the US left the nation scarred, and in a time of crisis, we had a rare instance of unity despite our political parties. A national unity that we could all benefit from by remembering it in our current political climate. Todd Beamer was one of the heroes of Flight 93. He, with fellow passengers, prepared themselves to regain control of their airplane after learning about the coordinated terrorist attacks. Right before going after the terrorists, he famously said, "Are you guys ready? Okay, let's roll." He likely saved hundreds of lives that day.
More people now realize that security is something they are personally responsible for. I think of an example of a flight from Los Angeles to Atlanta, Delta Airlines flight in June. The pilot came on the PA system and said, "I need able-bodied males to help me subdue an unruly passenger." And people streamed up to the front of the plane to help control this person. Sort of, you could say, the spirit of United Flight 93, one of the planes that crashed on September 11th. Remember, it was determined to be headed for Washington, but by the time it got 20 minutes flying time away from Washington, passengers had been using their cell phones, they'd been talking to people, they realized other planes had been hijacked, and they stormed the cockpit, and that's the reason the plane crashed in Pennsylvania and never hit its intended target in Washington.
The Todd Beamer effect has people all over the nation and the world consciously choosing beforehand how they'll act in an emergency terrorist attack. National security fundamentally changed because of these attacks. Mass surveillance of citizens as well as allies were a direct result, often bringing calls for the government to take a step back in their efforts to know everything about everyone. The war on terror was a confusing conflict with many challenges that modern warfare had never faced. It's hard to say whether or not the world is in a better place now than it was in 2001 before the invasions of the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands died so that the 43 million people in Iraq could be free. We can only hope that those deaths weren't in vain, like many people claim they were in Afghanistan. Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden both died ignominious deaths, and they can never oppress or kill anyone ever again. The American people will never forget the shock and the horror of the attacks that happened on September 11, 2001. We can only hope that future terrorist organizations will think twice before committing such atrocities after seeing what resulted from Osama bin Laden's actions. If you enjoyed hearing my take on Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, then you're going to want to check out this other video I made about Yevgeny Prigozhin, a terrorist mastermind who recently was assassinated in Russia. Check it out right there.